Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I'm very excited about the panel that we have today. We're talking about AI, and it's everyone's favorite topic. We always talking about AI these days, but we wanted to give you some more practical guidance. And I've got a wonderful set of panelists here that come from a deep background in AI. I've got some founders and legal experts. So let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. Sarah, would you go ahead and introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Great to be with you all today. I'm Sara Weed. I'm a partner at Gibson Dunn and Crutcher, based here in Washington, D.C. In addition to sort of, advising on all things sort of fintech and digital assets related, I work closely with clients who are exploring AI solutions in the financial services context. So great to be with you.
Thanks, Sarah. Dmitry, how about yourself?
Thanks for having me. I'm Dmitry Gritskevich, co-founder and CEO of ComplyCo. We are a monitoring and reporting platform trying to become your point of record for all of your compliance data so you can aggregate and monitor that. And some of that is going to be used using AI. And previously co-founded a consumer fintech like H&R. Been in fintech for the last 8 years or so. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Dmitry. And Kalyani, last but not least.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Kalyani, co-founder and CEO of Kobalt Labs. My personal background is I was actually an AI researcher in academia for a number of years. So excited to kind of provide some insight from the technical side. And then now I run Kobalt Labs, which is an AI platform to automate all kinds of like regulatory compliance and risk reviews to kind of cut all the paper pushing out of compliance.
Great. Thank you. All right. So we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. This is meant to be a more interactive session. So if you have questions, go ahead, drop them in the chat. Our panelists can see them. They can answer them. We're going to reserve some time at the end, about 10 to 15 minutes. But if you've got a question on a specific slide, we can go ahead and address that at that point in time as well. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today and what we're not going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about some large language models and generative AI. We're focusing on compliance workflows, oversight, and governance. What we're not going to talk about is some of the older rules engines, symbolic reasoning, as well as legacy machine learning, and that's just because we just don't have enough time. But one thing I want you all to keep in mind as we go through and listen to what our panelists have to say is we're thinking about the term AI as an intern, right? We're not talking about AI replacing everybody. We're not talking about compliance officers no longer being a thing. We all know at this point our jobs are safe. They might just be a little different. So we're talking about how to leverage AI to do our jobs better and faster. And with that in mind, Kalyani, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. Can you explain the distinction between today's AI tools and older automation like rules engines?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest distinction is that previous to, I would say like 2022, a lot of the AI use cases were really driven by either being extremely like data processing and like numeric heavy because they were in very like standard discrete formats that were very easily to compute on, or when AI was being done on things like, language and documentation, it was really, really brittle. Looking at things like keywords or predicting the next word and really not essentially having like a really deep understanding of like the context, but actually just understanding like individual words and like drawing kind of parallels at a really shallow level. So we've seen a very, very dramatic shift from kind of numerical processing and analytics and kind of very simple kind of language reasoning to now, AI really being able to like synthesize a 3,000 page document and like actually understand where are the potential issues. Like that's something that just wasn't possible until about like 1.5 to 2 years ago. So I think that's been the biggest shift in large language models. AI has of course existed for like over 20 years now, but I think the shift in being able to have kind of language reasoning is really brand new and has unlocked a lot of the use cases that we'll probably be talking about today.
Thanks, Kalyani. Dmitry, I want to ask you a question. What do you think is the biggest misconception you hear from compliance teams about AI's role?
I think we've had now kind of the latest iteration of AI, right, or introduction to it for almost 3 years since ChatGPT came out in 2022. And I think the pendulum has been swinging from, hey, it's not accurate enough, or it's always hallucinating, to, oh, it's going to achieve sentience, right? And it's going to replace all of our jobs. And so we've seen both ends of the spectrum. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle, as always. And we think that AI models, especially, and some of the ones that Kalyani is working on, right, could be very accurate. Even though OpenAI just released a research saying that hallucinations will always happen, and that's why you always need a human in the loop. Therefore, they will really not going to take necessarily all of our jobs either. So I think the reality is somewhere in the middle, but those two misconceptions we've definitely heard over the last few years.
Thank you. We definitely hear those a lot as well.
Yeah.
So Sarah, then from your perspective, how are you positioning AI adoption when you have clients that are concerned about regulatory risk?
Yeah, so I just want to start out by saying, you aren't in financial services if you're not thinking about regulatory risk. And so I think the instinct to be concerned about the way AI is deployed against the backdrop of this, highly regulated environment is exactly the right one. I think remaining attentive to that and those dynamics, the extent to which we need to have precision, we need to have, auditability, we need to have, a strong handle on sort of the underlying methodology. We need to have clarity around use cases. We're going to talk about all of these things, but I think, just really understanding that it's not a tool to be used casually. And frankly, nothing really is for financial services companies. The stakes are too high, particularly for things that are going to bear on the ultimate delivery of financial services products, which again goes to sort of you'll hear some themes today as we talk about, maybe the distinction between using these tools for workflow, which I know is where we're to spend the bulk of our conversation, versus, something that might be customer facing. The dynamics will be a bit different from a governance perspective, but, I do think that, again, being sort of thoughtful about the regulatory expectations and the regulatory stakes is something we should, very much keep front and center.
You made a really good point around treating compliance, right, as essentially as a risk function, right? You think about how, when we think about risk, a lot of times we think about credit risk or some sort of underwriting risk. The reality, compliance falls under the risk function as well, right? It's just a compliance risk, but it hasn't been as data driven necessarily, and I think this is where we're moving towards, right? Especially with the regulatory risk around how end users are interacting with digital systems, digital platforms. How do you monitor that? How do you extract that compliance data? And then ultimately develop, oversight capabilities that will help you oversee not just kind of overall interactions, but also the models that you're using, right, for analysis, right? So I think that's a really good point.
All of those are really great points. And, one thing I would add to that before we move on to our next slide is, those of us who've been around compliance for as long as we have. I'm not going to out myself and say how long I've been here, but it's more than a few years. We always talk about, especially with risk, qualitative versus quantitative assessment, and we really haven't been able to make that leap from qualitative to quantitative, even though we all know that's the North Star that we needed to get to. And I think that's one of the things I've been most excited about and really seeing as one of the big benefits is moving from a qualitative to a quantitative assessment and risk application. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and move on. We have a poll that we would love for our attendees to get a sense for how you're using AI. So it should have just popped up on your screen. And we'd love to know where you're primarily using AI today. So if you want to go ahead and answer that, there's probably more than one answer. So pick the one you use the most. I'm guessing we're probably not going to have a lot of that last one, though. So.
I'd love to vote as well, Robin, but I can't.
Okay. So then let's go ahead and we'll share the results of that poll here in a little bit. But let's go ahead and move on to what we were really excited to talk about, which is moving from, kind of the theoretical application of AI into a more practical application. So I'm going to start with Dmitry. From your experience, what are some of the biggest reasons that pilots, which is, we recommend that everyone run an AI pilot. You don't just start out with AI, you have to test it out. What are the biggest reasons the pilots are stalling inside financial institutions?
Let's define kind of different types of pilots, I would say, right? There are solutions, I think you have this on the slide, that are a little bit more workflow focused, right? That don't necessarily require heavy data integrations. And then there are solutions, that, for example, we work on that require data access, right? And those will take time, and they will potentially eventually provide a little bit more value, and will be very sticky, because once you install something, it's very hard to remove it, but it does take time. And I think some of the issues that we see specifically on the data integration piece, right, is having access to technical resources for pilots. From a bank's perspective or from a fintech's perspective, getting access to that information, getting access to data integrations, those are quite heavy in terms of IT resources. And so we see that takes a little bit more time, and sometimes stalls some of the pilots. And I think that's kind of one of the issues where you need to define the value upfront that you're going to try to provide, define the pilot, define the scope, and then align on the resources that you're really going to get to achieve that, because that's one of the reasons why it takes a long time to do anything.
So are you seeing a lot of success, or not a lot of success, when institutions, maybe they want to do a pilot, but let's say they don't have the resources dedicated, it's not a priority. Like, are you seeing that a lot right now? And maybe do you have any tips for kind of how to move past that?
Yeah, no, we're seeing that quite a bit. I think there was I think a moment in time where AI has gained quite a bit of attention. Then folks have calmed down, and starting to look at it more of okay, it's a tool, right, in our toolbox, and we want to apply to the problems we're trying to solve. Ultimately, not just to get AI for the sake of getting AI. And I think the types of integrations that you need in order to actually achieve real value that you might want to extract from AI will take time, right? And it will take resources to do that. So we definitely see that being one of the largest blockers on our end.
Kalyani, how about from your perspective? Are you seeing similar patterns, and what other things are you seeing that are affecting adoption?
Yeah, we're in a little bit of a different implementation position from Dmitry, because I think his company very much needs to be integrated with data to be able to really provide some of those insights. And for us, we don't actually have any integrations that are necessary, and so there's a little bit less of a getting technical buy-in for integrations or implementation. And you kind of just can start using a sandbox on day one. And so we have less of a problem with actually kind of getting pilots to kick off and really getting live. I think the biggest thing that we've realized that we need to show during a pilot is, how do you actually, how do you quantitatively assess what success means as part of a pilot? Because I think in general, at least for us, it's hey, we can spin Kobalt up, we can feel the efficiencies. How can we actually measure the comparison between the value of bringing us in versus your alternative method? And so for us, we've actually realized that we have to spend a little bit of time really scoping out what does success criteria look like, exactly how many people and how much time did it take to do this third-party risk review of these 100 policies and procedures, versus dumping it in Kobalt and letting AI fill out your risk assessments and identify controls. It's very intangibly valuable, but I think to get senior and executive buy-in, the folks using it just feeling like their lives are easier is not enough to justify bringing new expensive technology in. And so we spend a lot of time scoping out pilots and actually making sure that the business case is there.
Is there any pre-work that companies need to do ahead of time, to even say, hey, is this something we should go after? Should a company kind of have an idea of how many hours they're spending on a task, or where their pain points are before they even engage with you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends on the specific use case. I think there are some workflows that are simply just extremely painfully manual today, and it's relatively universal that like bringing in automation is going to help eliminate a lot of the like most rote manual work. But I think, and I think as part of pilots, like as like the technology providers, part of our job is also to ask those questions and like help the folks we work with like dig out some of those answers and figuring it out. I think the best homework that I would recommend institutions do as they start to bring in AI is really just about sometimes we see, you know, all the ducks are in a row really perfectly, but then all of a sudden there's, hey, you know, we actually have an AI council that meets every 6 months to approve technology. We're still figuring out whether or not we can bring an AI into this use case. So now we have to wait and see whether we can get that approval in 6 months. That really is the homework that I think makes the biggest difference, which is given that, you know, like assuming that we'll be able to get to those metrics and like achieve that success criteria, how do we actually make sure that internally there's enough momentum and there's like a position to actually get to a level of implementation and approval. And a lot of those hoops to jump through can probably be at least like mapped out clearly and like ironed out ahead of time, as opposed to saying, okay, now I have to figure out who do I have to go to, who is on our like AI council, like who has to approve some of this stuff.
That's actually a really good point, Kalyani. We were talking to one of the larger banks that had a policy of not using AI. That was part
Yeah.
of their overall policy, governance. They're planning on not using AI at least for the foreseeable future. Funnily enough, they have a lab that they're working on their own models at the same time. So this kind of a weird contradiction of, okay, we're running a bank, we're running a serious institution, and for now, the technology might not be ready, but we're also, creating a research lab, right, to essentially work on our own models at the same time. So it's a funny juxtaposition that we've seen at least as well.
I do though want to flag that I think there is something to be said for building that consensus and processes and governance around it before we are in the moment where we're executing. And so I know that some institutions may appear closed off, and some it may be just because they are. But I do think that for some number of institutions, it may be that sort of from an outward perspective, they need to be clear that they're not ready to engage because there is a recognition that there's work to be done. And until they have their own degree of fluency around it, I mean, we all know, even just knowing what questions to ask requires a familiarity that first, that is a learning curve of its own, and bringing in the right people and, and letting the experts sort of do what they can to drive value can have tremendous upside for institutions. But, I think that, regulators have been quite clear. We don't want you to dabble, right? Like if you're going to use something, any kind of a tool, any kind of technology, you need to be approaching it with a degree of seriousness. And so I think the question is sort of how can institutions best be in that learning mode and they're getting what they can without closing themselves off entirely. And Dmitry, I think that might be some of what you were alluding to, notwithstanding the contradiction that maybe we're going to put it in a different part of the org where we're going to let them sort of go and run and help us get smarter on the backside. That may not be the right approach in all instances, but I do think that's something we're seeing with some frequency.
Yeah, and even on top of this idea, I think there's almost two sides of the coin. On one hand, it's not good to dabble in the sense of kind of loosey-goosey, just like implementing all of these tools without properly figuring out what fits where. But I think on the other side of it, there's an important distinction of knowing where and when you can just kind of casually try things out. Like I think for any AI tool that, folks in the audience might be thinking about looking at or implementing, there should always be some way of getting at least a taste of the value without completely going deep into implementation. And so I think whether it's a sandbox, whether it's like a mini test or some kind of like small POC that doesn't involve a really deep implementation, even if it's even more lightweight than a pilot, I think I actually would encourage, I think sometimes there's such a roadblock to getting full implementation where people are almost afraid of testing things out in a lightweight way. And that's also what stalls adoption. So I would say like dabble in sandbox environments and lightweight tests more liberally if it truly is constrained and kind of not using your kind of actual true sensitive data. And then once that's validated, it'll be easier to do that deeper integration.
I think that's actually a phenomenal lead into the poll results, because I'm a little bit shocked. You see 52% of our folks who responded said they're using it for drafting a knowledge lookup, which I think is actually one of the best sort of low stakes use cases for engaging this technology and getting a feel for it and what it can do, and more importantly, what it can't do. So, 52%, that's pretty significant. And then we're seeing, the next is workflow assistance at 20%, data integrator reviews, KYC, AML marketing. I think, in my opinion, we're seeing a lot of really cool companies that are coming out to do that. But like Dmitry had mentioned, it's a bigger lift to integrate those tools. So that's not where I would always start. And then 18% not using. So I think that's really interesting. Love for those 18%, love to understand why you're not using it, and maybe we can convince you to try a low stakes pilot as a result of this.
And I wonder if in your drafting knowledge lookup is primarily just driven by the tools that already exist, right? So whether it's ChatGPT or Claude, right, there are being allowed kind of to access by employees at the bank. That might be one of the use cases essentially, right? And yes, we're using AI, but it's not necessarily a kind of a bank approved vendor, so to speak.
Yeah. But also on the flip side of that, we still have to be careful, because you have to have AI governance in place to even interact with the free tools. So hopefully if you're an institution or at an institution, you're using ChatGPT, which can be a great tool for a lot of the stuff. You should probably have an AI policy if you don't have one. So there's a great question that has come in, that it also echoes another question we received ahead of the webinar. And I want to hear from Kalyani and Sara on this. And that is, how can I trust AI when I don't know what I don't know? And can you talk a little bit about, maybe some of the concerns that regulators have proposed or talked about with regards to these tools as well? So Kalyani, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, totally. And I have a lot of thoughts on this. This is partially what some of my research was about, which is like, how do you use AI in context of like, it's like healthcare or like financial services or like pharma, like just very like high criticality systems, and how can you actually like implement it with accuracy, but also transparency. And the other side of it is, I think almost half of Kobalt's customers have actually gone through exams and actually shown how they've used Kobalt as part of this process. So we've talked a lot with regulators about, it's that we know a lot of the questions they ask and the ways that they respond to a lot of this. And I would say one of the first questions that our customers get from regulators are, hey, how are you validating AI's results? How can we be sure that you're not blindly using it as a black box and actually maintaining the responsibility you have? Because ultimately you can't outsource the final responsibility, no matter how many efficiency gains you're getting. And so that all is a big lead up to this question, which is, how can you actually do that kind of verification? How can you trust it? Both how can you trust it and how can you show regulators that you're not blindly trusting it? I think those are the two important sides of this coin. And so typically, I think this really depends on what is the maturity of the AI tool you're using. I think there are some, and again, like not all AI tools are built the same. There's so much engineering in the background. They have wildly different accuracies, wildly different layers of transparency. So it's really about picking a tool that's going to do this properly. So I think there are some tools that will kind of just, give you results without showing that important like logical reasoning trail, or showing those showing citations, or that explainability is kind of the technical term of how they call it. And so I think the right way to do it is to pick a tool that's going to say, hey, here's this thing that we've generated. Here's exactly where we're getting this information from. Here's exactly where this answer is coming from in the logical reasoning. So you can kind of follow it and understand where that came from. And then so you can also very easily verify its results. So I think, and just speaking for how we've architected it, and I'm sure Dmitry has thoughts on like how they've solved this problem in like a different way too. At least with Kobalt, whenever Kobalt identifies, a control, in a large amount of documentation, it's not going to say we found it. It's going to say we found it, open up the right document and highlight where it found it. And so the way that we think about this is, you should be able to use a good AI tool without trusting AI, but it should be so easy to verify it. Because sometimes verifying AI's results takes so long that you might as well have just done it manually yourself. And so we want to make it very easy for AI to give results, but then even quicker to immediately verify where AI got its information. And if that loop is done properly, then you actually don't have to trust AI, but you can still get the benefits from it. So I would flip it and say, don't blindly trust AI, but make sure it's verifiable. And then again, that paper trail and audit trail is what you can then show to regulators. Say, hey, here's actually, here's where you can see that there was like a human sign off on this piece, or here's where you can see in the technology that there was a human in the loop, that we were able to verify it. And then a lot of these issues actually start to go away. Like, we've gotten a lot of great feedback from regulators saying, if as long as you're able to show that AI is simply making you better at your job rather than you outsourcing your important strategic work, then they're actually like surprisingly like really fully on board, more than people would expect.
And so, Kalyani, I think you have said it so well. And so I'll nibble around the margins with the full recognition that I will not be able to rival that response. So I think at the heart of the question, though, is like, how do I trust it, right? And I think that question is at the center of conversations with regulators. It's going to be the conversation you have at the C-suite level with your board if they're properly engaged. Obviously, sort of the staff line level, that question comes up over and over and over again. And I think it's a really healthy grounding question. It cannot be the case that we say, let's use, throw in another sort of form of technology. If a regulator asked, how did you get to the answer? And you said, well, the internet said so. Like, that would not be a satisfying answer. And so I think the reality is like better understanding sort of how you are using that tool, how it's being leveraged, how, just as you would with any other output, whether from a human or from a piece of technology, you're in a position to validate it, and how you aren't doing that like sort of incidentally, but as a matter of course. It's just something that has to become muscle memory. And so, I think in some ways the AI conversation is an uncomfortable one in regulated financial institutions because there are some processes for which in the analog world or in sort of a non-AI instance where we don't have good answers to those questions, to the same questions. And so the fact that we are having to think about this from a process management perspective, and we are having to think about, using the language of risk, as Dmitry said, and talking more affirmatively about controls and what we're doing to assess, getting to a place that we can quantify and be comfortable with that quantification if it's possible. Those are all things that we have to get more comfortable doing. And it's not sort of because it's AI that we need to be doing that. We need to be doing that because that's just the expectation in terms of making sure we're getting it right. And so I think that this is like, we should, as Kalyani said, not be, in the habit of thinking that we're going to get to a place where we trust it. Just like you may have worked with a colleague for a decade, but you're still going to ask the question to better understand their thought process, or, review work before we've all signed off. Like, those are just things that we do to make sure we're putting forward our best. And with an AI tool sort of in our repertoire, we will do it as to the AI tool's output. And meanwhile, I think all the things around sort of even just like how being prepared to show our thinking on why this tool, why this way, why now, is something just it doesn't go away. I think there's this impression that like, if we can just get to the place where we're familiar enough or know enough, we're going to be able to say, I'm good. And the regulators are going to say, I'm comfortable. But that's not really the relationship between financial institutions and regulators, nor the relationship of risk and compliance professionals with others and organizations. And it shouldn't be. It's that healthy challenge that's going to help us continue to deliver more successfully.
Sara and Kalyani, that's phenomenal information there. And I honestly couldn't have said it better myself. And I would just add on to that, we circling back to the pilot to production, this is one of those questions. So you're not just looking at efficiency gains when you're doing a pilot. You want to be evaluating, can I do this? Can I, all the things that Sara just said and all the things that Kalyani said, can I actually evidence that I did this? Which is something, like Sara said, if we were implementing a non-AI tool in compliance, we would ask that question as well. Is there an audit trail? So very similar questions we already know how to ask. Great. Okay, good stuff. Thank you guys so much for that. So let's actually dive in a little bit on what makes regulator ready AI. So Sarah, I'm going to come back to you. Can you give me an idea how compliance professionals, like all of us, think about our oversight role when it comes to AI? And, what is that term that we kind of threw out early, AI as an intern? What does that actually mean in your words?
Yeah, so I think that thinking about AI as an asset, whether it's equivalent to a human asset or another kind of tool, is really really important. We like to, as we acclimate regulators to the use of tools, we try to be very clear that a solution is not owning something end to end. It might be playing a role in a process, but it is by no means sort of playing all parts, if you will. And so in that way, compliance professionals remain, responsible for, utilization of the tool, evaluation of outputs, assessment of the efficacy of a particular tool on sort of a more of a process level. And being in a position to be close enough to the outputs and to the process that can speak with a degree of fluency about sort of how it's showing up. And so in that way, I would say it's just like, if you had somebody new to an organization, you would by no means sort of just like let them loose and have them go and sort of do all the things, right? You would be thoughtful about the scope of their responsibilities. You would be clear about how to contextualize their contributions relative to the whole. You would by no means say that they should sort of run something end to end. And so, I think to the extent that, an intern is a helpful way for us to sort of personify this, I think it's a nice shortcut.
Thanks, Sarah. So Dmitry and Kalyani, I'm going to start with Dmitry, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, Kalyani. We've talked a little bit about that proof and that evidence. What does that documentation look like? What is a regulator actually going to come in and ask you for?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's not necessarily even dissimilar to going through a full vendor diligence, right, for a traditional tool. I mean, you have to really understand, first of all, what kind of data you are getting access to. Some of our customers have provisioned us for access to non-PII data, which comes with a certain level, right, of security and certain level of concern about the third-party provider. And some of our customers are actually asking us to store PII, right? So when we get to that runtime, access to the runtime data, and we are able to store social security number, first name, last name, you name it, that has to be protected, right? And luckily there have been and now quite a few KYC BSAML tools, right, that have followed the same in a way framework, and I think we're following in their steps as well in terms of how to protect that data, how to make sure that we don't necessarily give access to our employees to that, right, and how do we ultimately use cybersecurity to do that. I think there is a level of documentation that comes with that. Level of documentation that comes with you passing certain frameworks, right, that exist out there. So SOC 2 Type 2 audit is a given. It's table stakes now for all vendors, and if they don't have that, it's hard to even pass any type of InfoSec diligence. So for younger startups, that's literally essentially a step number one, right? To get through their SOC 2 Type 2. Luckily, there's tools out there that help you do that. But that's your table stakes. And then you start adding more complexity depending on the type of vendor you are, right? Depending on the type of data you have access to, the type of process you are really solving for them. So I think that's kind of the table stakes, but Kalyani, feel free to add some more.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's not as different from just like standard like vendor diligence as you might think. And agreed, SOC 2, all of those important building blocks are the same whether you're an AI tool or whether you're just taking kind of regular important data from a financial institution. I would say the only real difference, and I'll give one caveat, is again, all this depends on the kind of AI tool. There's like an incredible amount of variance here. Like if there's an AI tool that's actually interacting with customers, if you're buying like a voice AI chatbot, that's an extremely different kind of diligence than a back office tool like Kobalt or ComplyCo. So if you're using a voice AI chatbot, then there's a lot to look at with respect to like UDAP and how it interacts with customers and what do like safeguards look like there and like all of these things. I think and maybe this is good for everyone in this call, which is also that there's levels of, you know, maybe I'll say like criticality of AI tools you can bring in. I would say maybe a customer facing chatbot is one of the most critical things, right? Because a mistake can be truly catastrophic versus if you take a step back in the back office with a human in the loop, it's generally like a lower risk place. So start thinking about AI because there is human intervention at every piece. You have full oversight and it's not something that's kind of running free without someone at the institution like knowing what's going on. So by being a back office tool, we're also subject to a little bit of a lighter review because ultimately the stakes are not as high as, someone telling a customer that there's no fees on this or something like that. And so I think as a back office tool going through that diligence, it's basically very similar to like a standard piece of, SaaS. And then the difference really becomes, again, like Dmitry said, what is the sensitivity of data coming in? We don't even take in PII, so luckily we haven't even had to necessarily go in that direction. And then the most important thing is, we're uploading like vendor and bank documentation into a tool like this, right? Our internal policies, procedures, disclosures, some contracts, etc. And so for us, it really comes down to what's happening when AI touches our data. It's maybe not the most sensitive data, but it's still IP of our customers. And so it really comes down to like, is AI retaining the data we upload into your system? And is AI training on the data we upload into your system? I think those are just the two most fundamental questions. I think if it's a back office tool and those two answers are no, then it actually just becomes very similar to like a standard vendor diligence assessment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that the criticality to your point around anything customer facing, right?
Yeah.
You don't have the time to review the answer, right? If it's
Exactly.
a chat bot that is actually displaying something, and there were all these memes going around, right, on Twitter around someone what was it? Someone buying a new car for $1, right? And the AI chatbot agreeing to sell it for $1 and as a binding contract. So that you can't review that, right, and approve that. But I think the back office tools, right, to your earlier point around investigation ability, understanding of, where did they get the data, what kind of data is analyzed, can we go in deep into the platform and understand the paper trail, and having the time to actually say, yes, this worked. That's a very different threshold versus real-time customer interaction.
Great stuff, guys. Thank you. So let's move on and talk a little bit about what that pilot can look like and what the evaluation and change management can look like at your institution. So Kalyani, I'm going to throw the first question back to you. So let's say that we're going to go do a pilot. I'm an institution, I'm going to go do a pilot. What are some practical ways that you would tell me that I can evaluate and compare AI tools for, things that we talked about earlier?
Like the question is more so like, what are the things we should be measuring? And like, what does it look like to compare tooling? Yeah, totally. And I think we spend a lot of time, I just mentioned, we've been doing a lot of scoping of like what does success look like. So this has been very top of mind for our team. Again, for parroting this caveat again, it depends on the use case and the application of AI. For our specific domain, it really comes down to efficiency and accuracy. We have, and maybe a third metric being usability, but that's not quite as AI specific. But like those are the three kind of metrics of success that we have. So for efficiency, we really look at, let's take these processes, let's literally, side by side, go through it your standard way, and then go through the same process using our tool, and let's literally time how long it took. And it's actually pretty easy to just do that like direct comparison. And then the second piece is, forgetting about time and even just looking at the output. For us, our outputs are very well defined. It's like, let's look at, the outputs of this risk assessment or exactly what areas of non-compliance Kobalt was able to flag. Like, let's take something that's been reviewed by your team already, and then let's take that same thing, pre-human review. Let's actually literally compare how well do the outputs of our AI tool match up with the human review. And not just does it exactly match up, but more importantly, I think we try to be more ambitious. Did AI find things that human reviewers missed. That's always my gold standard, and we always try to make sure that that happens, because we don't just want to show that AI is giving giving you efficiency but not losing accuracy, but there's a lot of opportunity for AI to actually increase accuracy. And so, yeah, I would say those are the two metrics that we're kind of laser focused on.
Thanks,
Would just
Kalyani.
add maybe the from a pilot perspective specifically, right? Focus on something very granular that the teams are actually outputting right now. And sometimes AI solutions necessarily miss that because they think of a larger problem their AI can solve versus, well, I actually need this report. And that report it could be as silly as, hey, comparing these two numbers together, right? And the way it's done right now is I literally take a sample of accounts and I do that manually for whatever, 100 accounts, for example, right? Versus a machine, it can do that for the entire population faster, more accurate in some ways, right? So I think that's the really one of the aspects that we would like to focus is how do we define the most granular thing that could improve their day-to-day, right, workflow. I think that's been really helpful.
And one thing I just want to flag is like these conversations and documenting these conversations internally is tremendously important to sort of instilling confidence, both at, sort of as you think about different stakeholders across the enterprise, whether it is helping sort of recognize that the pilot isn't where it should stop and we should think about this more broadly, or, beefing up the frequency of, maybe it's your governance cycles so that you've got, you don't have, Kalyani said something, I think like we had to wait maybe 6 months to get on a, or might have been Dmitry, apologies, like get on a, the docket and talk through this with the right people, but, it's not happening quarterly. Well, how do we do that? If we have something really tangible we can point to in terms of whether it's efficiency, usability, we're solving a real problem across the institution. We're in a position to tackle a backlog that we know has been a real source of stress, or something that's been flagged by maybe a regulator as something we're under-resourced on. Like, I think that can really catalyze interest across the enterprise and put you in a position to be much more front-footed about these conversations, especially with regulators, because if you've had to bring those stakeholders along and you've been able to demonstrate that this has value internally, it is, you don't have to go much further, right, to be able to have much the same conversation with regulators, admittedly, maybe through a slightly different prism, but, being able to sort of get our compliance resources in the right places and deployed more effectively is something that I think is universally acknowledged as a key objective, both for enterprises and for their regulators.
Fantastic advice, all three of you. Thank you so much. I want to remind everyone, please ask questions. We've got 2 really great questions in the queue right now that we are going to get to. So go ahead and throw your questions in. There's no dumb questions. And we will make sure that, we will address as many as we can. So while we're waiting for a couple more questions to come in, Dmitry, I'd actually like to ask you a pretty specific question. And that is, so let's say that we've done all the things that you 3 have talked about. We've, established what we're measuring, what we're doing. What does a good pilot design actually look like from there?
Yeah, maybe piggybacking on some of the early answers, right? Again, being very granular, right? And understanding exactly what the output is going to be delivered within a very relatively short period of time that you might have, right? Banks, you have to be patient, first of all, with banks, right? Because they want to learn about your solution. They want to see what problem it's solving. And then when they're ready, they're ready. Then you have to deliver on that problem. But you have to define what actually you are delivering on, right? What is the granular output that you're providing? What kind of resources you need, right, in order to be able to do that? And ultimately identify the stakeholders, right, who will benefit from that solution within that organization. Right? Is it just the compliance team, right? Is it the BSAML team? Is it some part of the risk team, right? You have to really identify and figure out who benefits, right? Who ultimately will then be a champion for you to get your solution installed in production going forward, and having them on board, showing them that you're delivering value, And that value might be very minimal initially, right? Because it's a proof of concept. You might be showing how you automate a specific process, right? That are very specific, and that allows you to then get them on your side and actually get the proof of concept going right in the right direction. So I would say those are the most important pieces, right? And then, as you are kind of installing your system in there and you're forming relationships, keep be proactive. Be actually proactive around, hey, we need this information. We need to get this piece moving. And I think that's the most important thing within the institution, because they have their own day-to-day work life, right, that they're dealing with, right? So your POC might not be the most important thing. So that's also, keep in mind that you're ultimately trying to improve their lives, but they also have other tasks to do. So just make sure that you're cognizant of that.
Great. Very practical advice. So I'm going to flip to one of the questions that we had come in, and Kalyani, I'm going to throw this one at you, but I'd also love to hear if Sarah and Dmitry, if you guys have thoughts on this as well. And that is, how do you deal with AI hallucination, given the serious implications when dealing with regulatory scrutiny?
Yeah. I think Dmitry brought up that good point, which is even, the most like foundational AI researchers can really show that ultimately this idea of like never hallucinating is not something that's going to be solved. However, what can be solved is detecting when AI hallucinates. And so I would almost flip it by saying, how can we, again, this goes back to this thing with how can we use something responsibly, knowing that it's not perfect, but knowing that, completely dismissing it because it's not completely perfect would be such a kind of irrational loss as well in a lot of ways. And so the way that we've at least approached it is when Kobalt's AI kind of generates some kind of finding in some capacity, it essentially is not allowed to generate that finding unless it can specifically cite something directly in the regulation or directly in the documentation that's being reviewed. And so on the back end, if you look at Kobalt's like AI logs, it comes up with maybe 50 things, but we actually only surfaced to the users the 25 things that it was actually able to give a very precise and visible citation for. And so again, it goes back to like, I think like the architecture of the tool. Like number one, is it self-validating on the back end and actually pruning out those hallucinations for you and only giving you what it's able to validate? So we spend a lot of engineering time on the validation of AI, more than just the AI generation piece. I would say the majority of the time that our engineering team spends is actually how do we test AI's outputs and make sure that they're correct and prune out the ones that aren't. That's actually the harder problem in a lot of ways. And so that's one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is also, if you're not doing it that way, another really common way that really well architected AI tools are solving this is providing, some level of like confidence scoring or some transparency as to which answers are better than others. Saying, hey, this output, we have 99%, conviction on, but this AI output, it has like, 50% confidence on. There's a lot of little ways where you can actually, it goes back to transparency again, where you can actually just see, can it give me the citation? Can it give me the level of confidence it has in its answer? So those are all ways that you won't necessarily solve the like deep AI hallucination problem, which is unsolved by anyone, but you can at least solve the risk of hallucination to you and like mitigate that.
Just that you should also define the threshold, right, by which what accuracy are you expecting, right, from this tool, right, from this process. There is some there, you want 100% accuracy, and that AI might not be the right solution in that case, right? But the reality is you can get even the standard kind of model, ChatGPT, to 90% accurate relatively quickly, right? It's very hard to, to Kalyani's point, to get from 90 to 95 and then 95 to 97 and so on and so forth. But you might be using it for different workflows. You might be using it for different tasks. And I think the reason why folks are saying in their poll response is that they're using it for drafting because they can review it, right? They can review it relatively quickly. They don't expect that 99.9% accuracy necessarily. It's just a lot easier to read a letter, right, or a page than to write a page. And that's why they're using the tools for that. So I would say define the accuracy that you're expecting And I think that will help you also understand kind of how important hallucinations are to you, actually.
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, the reality is that there is no such thing as sort of 100% accuracy. I mean, we have this thing called human error. We've been dealing with this in compliance for as long as there's been compliance. Even the most, high touch processes are prone to, error of one kind or another. And so I think in some ways we set ourselves up to fail by sort of out of the gate having this question like, how do I quantify how accurate this tool is? Well, we don't score our employees that way. We don't say that's the colleague that gets it right 72% of the time. But we do know that, no single asset or single individual, is going to be without sort of need for some degree of controls, automated or otherwise. And so I think it goes back to what Dmitry said about knowing how to slot these tools in and what we need to put around them from a controls perspective, and being really clear-eyed about when it may or may not make sense. But I do think that, even it all comes back to that question of trust. And, for those of us who may have this fantasy that we're going to just, plug in a tool and never have to think about it again, that's not what this is. And I don't think that's frankly what we want it to be. And so, I do think we need to be really, really honest with ourselves about why that hallucination risk is concerning. And I think it's only if you don't have processes around it that it really is likely to get away from us.
Great question. Great answers. Thank you all very much. So we are coming up to the top of the hour here. I would love to ask our panelists one final question, and that is, what is the single most important lesson that you'd like the attendees to apply after today's session? And I want to go ahead, Sarah, we just heard from you. I'd love to hear your perspective, and then Dmitry and Kalyani.
Yeah, in some ways, I'm going to come across as a Luddite. I mean, I promise that I work in and around technology all day long. So, but I think it's, some of this is very simple in the sense that, foundational principles of compliance continue to play through this domain as they did prior domains. Many of us were trained by people who did this work without the benefit of a computer on their desk. And without the ability to answer an email from our pockets. Like, there's so much that's changed about the way that compliance professionals do their work. And so I encourage us all to be open to the possibility that this tool will, like those others, really change the way we work, but potentially give us the opportunity to focus in on the things that really matter, so we can have a conversation about sort of risk and keep sort of risk at the center, as opposed to it being about, covering all the waterfront with the same degree of intensity, which is of course not what any of us, can or should be doing.
I would say, I think whether we like it or not, maybe to your point, we live in this world of very proactive intent now, right? There's so much information that is available to us, and we should take advantage of that. And I think part of that, if I could maybe instill one advice, is understand what your internal problems are. What are you trying to solve, actually, right? Because sometimes your most pressing problems might not be the ones that are addressable by AI solutions necessarily, right? So define your internal problems, understand them really, really well, and then actually proactively look for a solution that solves those problems. All right. So I think that you're very practically, really, if your biggest issue is, some fraud, BSA, ML, transaction monitoring solution, look for that solution, right? If your biggest issue is third-party risk management, evaluate Kalyani's solution, right? If your biggest issue is monitoring, right, look at ComplyCo. So I think that's the really more practically, look at what your issues are right now, understand them in depth, and then try to understand what solutions out there that are trying to help you.
Yeah, I love that. I couldn't have put that better. That was really great. I think maybe I now have to say something that Dmitry didn't already say. I would say, honestly, I think the biggest thing is I hear so many people saying, oh, we're hearing AI is coming, like, maybe next year it'll be good enough for us to use. But I would say there's a lot more, and we saw by the poll that was taken, right? Like it's already being used today and already providing a lot of value today. So I would say, and it's kind of hard to maybe get out of the kind of risk averse mindset, of course, because now we're all in the kind of risk and compliance phase, but kind of bias a little bit towards action, but like responsible action. Like you can already start thinking about your problems, kind of looking into tools that can help you now rather than like next year's cycle. And there's a lot of institutions that are doing this and already seeing a lot of good results today. And so it's less so this thing that's like going to come. And in a lot of ways, this thing that already happened and is just continuing to happen. So I would say like it's really like now is kind of the time to start doing it and then kind of stop waiting for it.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thanks to everyone who attended our webinar today and our panelists. We are so thankful for your time and hope you have a great rest of the day. Oh, and there's also CLE credit. Take a look at the code here if you need it.
Thank you for having us, Robin.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Robin. That was great.
Thank you. I appreciate it.